Yeah, I think this is our fourth conversation, isn't it?
Could be. I haven't been counting.
Yeah, me neither. Um, we look more at the cognitive stuff, and I mean, we're still talking about cognitive science and all of that stuff today, but I would really love to look at the learning.
Yeah.
Learning and this intersection of how do you teach something so that other people can learn it well.
Right. Okay.
And I would love to look at that both in just a broad overview, even though I know that you've done a lot of that on your podcast with what is learning, blah, 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 blah. But the thing I'm most fascinated or interested in is the books I read about learning are always about knowledge, and they kind of condense everything to knowledge. And the thing I would love to talk about is, what about like physical skills and things that are not intellectual skills on a piece of paper, but that have to do with movement? How do the same principles of teaching apply to that?
Okay.
That's kind of my bigger question. And how we get to that, I have no idea, but I think we're going to find a way.
Yeah. Movement to me, so I haven't looked at movement as much. To me, it actually adds a major spanner in the works. So there's a book I covered on the podcast a long time ago called The Inner Game of Tennis. Is it that one that maybe it was in The Inner Game of Tennis? Yeah, it was, sorry. Yeah, so basically it talks about tennis, and it says like, you know, when you try and teach someone, like what's going on inside someone's head when they're learning, and like how should you teach them? Well, mostly what's going on inside someone's head rather than how should you teach them. But it says that, you know, you have this kind of critical voice in your head, and then you've got the ability to carry out actions. And these are two separate entities. The author calls them self one and self two. So the thing that carries out the actions, basically, you don't have to, it feels like you're not thinking when you do them. Let's put it that way. It depends on how you define what the word think means, which is a bit funny, but you know, you can do something like pick something up without having to, you know, analyze your actions, or you know, you can just do it. But when you're doing something like learning a physical skill like tennis, then you you're trying to improve your action. You're trying to like get more balls in the court, or get them into the position you wanted them to go. So you're trying to hone your skill. And then the author makes the point that usually people try to do this by criticizing verbally their actions, whereas in fact that's quite ineffective. It's also very stressful, because you sort of attack yourself with criticism, possibly. I mean, it depends on your mood, but you can certainly attack yourself with criticism, like, oh, that was terrible, sort of thing, which doesn't really particularly help you to actually hit the ball better. And what you need to do, according to this author, is that you basically need to shut that critic up and just observe while your sort of non-linguistic part of your mind or brain carries out, you know, does the body, the thing that's connected to your body basically is non-linguistic. So you got to let that part do what it's doing without thinking about it in verbal terms, and just observe the result, and then carry on, you know, non-verbally carrying this out without thinking about well, yeah, I mean, that's it, non-verbally, right? So without adding layers of commentary to what you're doing, just going, okay, when I do this, this happens. When I do this, this happens. Although without those words, even just the feeling of that process. And that's the idea. And I think the reason there is a basis for this. I mean, the author wrote this as a coach, so he had a lot of practical knowledge of learning tennis and teaching tennis, but his knowledge of cognitive science and neurology in a kind of a more formal way is limited. So he isn't really approaching it from that perspective. But I think we can basically say that the parts of your brain even that are responsible for connection with your body, or direct like control of your body parts, are like very, very widely separated from the brain regions that are responsible for language on the whole. Now, there are some connections, like for example, grounded words. If you say a word like kick, then actually there's a part of your motor cortex that lights up to do with your legs. So that, but this is very small kinds of connections. They're not
and at the same
effective.
time, like if I look at this, and this is the one of the books you recommend and I really enjoy too, like if he talks about teaching, Peps McCree, which by the way, still a great name.
Yes.
He talks about long-term memory, working memory, and that in a way knowledge, and for him included in knowledge is skill, is long-term memory. So even if we go to the tennis example, like by improving our movement, by improving our whatever we do when we improve tennis, our grip, our arm swing, our stance, we will improve long-term memory in one way. It's just a different type of long-term memory than verbal long-term memory, where I've studied something and thus I know what the capital of Norway is. But it's still long-term memory. It's still something that's ingrained in the brain, but also the nervous system and to some degree our body. So the question would be, how does that work, and how can I as a coach or as a teacher use those embodied, or teach those embodied aspects, and maybe even taking a step away from tennis. Chemistry. I know that chemistry is something you know more about than probably tennis.
Yes.
So I can teach and understand chemistry theoretically, but there's also an element of I can learn how to do certain chemical processes and experiments and all of that. And I imagine they are linked, but they are not the same.
Yeah, that last one, the chemistry example is actually going to be more difficult because it's kind of crossing these wires.
Exactly,
so,
and I think that's what I'm most interested in, because at least in the fields I'm in, where it's about like body work, massage, therapy, we have certain knowledge we need, but we also need certain skills that go beyond just thinking.
Yes.
So how on earth does that happen?
It's probably going to be easier for me to, I think the short answer is that I don't have a full theory of it, and I'm probably going to wing it while we're talking, because
there we go. I think that's the best place to be.
But where I do feel a bit more comfortable, and where I'll start from, is other examples of physical skills. So I've got quite a lot of experience of learning dance. So, and I had several coaches, but one particularly good coach, and I remember the way that he would teach. Well, anyone would teach, but him in particular. How they would teach, and that tells me something about the way that, what ways of teaching bodily motion, or how do you improve as a dancer. And then another one is basketball, because of my looking at John Wooden, a basketball coach. So that's slightly different cases. I mean, in terms of dancing, I'll speak from my own personal experience a little bit. So I started that when I went to uni. So I was 18 years old when I first began, and then I did 4 years of fairly intensive training, and since then I haven't done so much, and I'd quite like to get back into some form, but it's not always been easy, just for personal life reasons. But I'll get back to it. But anyway, I did quite a lot of this, and I was training like often 6 days a week, some of the time. So it was a pretty major part of my life, and I got a very close look at the process of this, how to become a better dancer, basically. And I suppose in many ways, actually, it is quite analogous to how you would teach lots of other things, because you start off with the most basic principles, or I suppose really what you start off with is you have to start off dancing something. So you start off like, okay, let's do this move, and then you do this, you just get familiar with the move so you can like carry out some steps. Let's do this routine, it has 5 moves in it or something, so we're going to do these steps, and it takes, I don't know how long, 30 seconds, 1 minute, something like that. So then you've got something to work on, because if you don't have anything to work on, there's nothing you can do. And then the entire kind of point of this afterwards was to try, and it wasn't try to learn more steps, that wasn't our focus, it was to try and improve the quality so it looks better, basically. So then we would go through lots of principles and try and improve them one by one. So one is posture. So we'd be learning like how to stand basically, and then we would like try and dance while maintaining that position. And then you would always, normally, unless you're sort of superhuman, you would have, you would fail in your posture at some point. Like your posture would go awry during your dance. So then like the coach would point out, oh, look at that moment, you weren't standing up straight, or your weight was in the wrong place. And then by paying attention to these errors and places where you're going back to your old habits, then you gradually ingrain like a new habit basically, in different positions during your dance. And then it could be, okay, like posture is very important, but another thing that's very important is timing. So let's like, do an exercise where we practice essentially being on time, and this is the way to be on time. So let's practice that. And that's very important. So, it sounds trivial, but actually, there are details to it, and it's easy to like mess it up. You can be sloppy. So it's like, let's not be sloppy. So, there's that. And then there's, footwork, like your feet, you have to follow this exact movement in order to look good. So, let's practice. And then you just, again, later you just dance and you go, oh, look, your footwork started getting sloppy. So you need to like remind yourself and get back to it. So basically lots of different, be it posture or timing or footwork or whatever else, you're working on these things. And importantly, you're working on them one at a time. So that connects to the more knowledge-based, if you like, questions, through the idea of long-term and working memory in particular. So you can't actually, what you're doing when you're practicing, say like practicing improving your footwork, is your concentration is all in your feet. You've just got this huge amount of awareness in your feet. And it means everything else is going on autopilot, which is like saying everything else is following your long-term memory with very low levels of attention, or very low space taken up in your working memory. And that's why you need to like practice the moves in the first place for a while, so that they're in your long-term memory. You don't have to think about doing the moves. You can think about improving them because they're like automatic now. But all your attention is in your feet. And what's going to happen when you do that is your posture is going to go messed up. But it's important to go like, okay, but I'm not working on posture now. My attention is in my feet. So you're practicing that particular thing, right? And then like by putting your attention there and like essentially, again, to use this terminology again, by applying your working memory in such a way to force your behavior into a new or a different kind of behavior, right? With the way your feet move, for example, when you do that enough times, you start to like etch it inside your long-term memory. And then it starts to become more automatic, more natural. And even when you're not thinking about it, you will actually be doing it more. It's easy to do it that way. So it's like a schema build up in that respect. Yes?
Yeah, building on top of each other. So two things, like number one, the way you describe the dancing you've been doing, it's kind of, there is a certain way it's supposed to look.
Yeah, basically.
And you can get
especially before you reach a very advanced level, because it's like, at some level you could say, well, there's style, you could do it this way, you could do it that way, but at a low level, everyone is so far away from that there's just basics to build up.
Yeah. So. Okay, just because there are different ways of dancing, and there are also like different dances. Like I danced tango argentino for a while, where it's not about posture necessarily. It's actually about
I've also danced it. I like it, and they did tell me my posture was I was trying too hard.
Exactly, where it's like, how can you feel comfortable so that you can walk together?
Yeah, instead of like, whoa, like,
yeah, exactly.
Why do you look at that?
But I like that as a even as a sign, because that's, again, it would be teaching different things, and it would be it has a different kind of direction you want to guide people in. So if it's ballroom dancing, where there's a certain posture you want people to be and stay in, whereas if you teach tango argentino, or even like tango nuevo, where it's even more relaxed, it's not about the posture, but it may be about the relationship. And it's all about so you have different pointers, you have different schemas you build up. And depending on which schemas you deem or value more importantly, you will teach different things, and you will have to follow different steps.
Yeah. Well, I mean, essentially what one way of viewing all of this is we're looking at the difference between, and the journey that takes you from being a beginner to an expert. And in that regard, on one level, you're essentially trying to copy an expert, but people who do this too directly, some people basically say, why are we doing, exercises? We should all be doing whatever the experts are doing, because we just, that's what they do. So let's just copy them. But that tends to fail, because there's a lot of stuff that the experts do that's hidden. It's kind of, it's complicated because it's layered. Like there might be 3 or 4 factors which are changing their mind about what to do, but you can't see all the factors at once. You know, you need to understand, you need the principles, basically, you need the basics. They're going to break rules that beginners shouldn't be breaking, for example, because some of the time there'll be special cases where they'll understand that, oh, well, you know, 95% of the time I always follow this thing. But in this case, because they have like this flexibility of large amounts of knowledge, they can be like, well, we can kind of.
And can I come in right there? Large amounts of knowledge.
Yeah.
What kind of knowledge in this case?
So okay, so because we're talking about the difference between bodily stuff and mental stuff.
Yeah, and I think this is the details that I'm really interested in.
Okay, so I'll take it back to dancing, which is somewhat of my home territory again. So when it comes to large amounts of knowledge, I mean, okay, so you have knowledge of, so you've danced a lot, so you know what it feels like, and you kind of know what good and bad feels like. That's one thing that kind of goes in, it kind of becomes slightly subconscious. You start going like, oh, this is weird. Whereas before, like maybe everything is weird, even the good stuff, right? Or like, you have no sense of discrimination, but afterwards you have a sense of like, oh, that seems good and that seems bad. And it's more likely to actually be in accordance with what does, you know, look good and bad, for example, or look appropriate to the dance, let's say. I mean, good and bad, you know, take it with a pinch of salt, but like look right for this style, if you like. And another thing, I mean, so here's an example, a really pertinent, I think it's pertinent example anyway. So, you know, we had this thing about posture drilled into us a lot because it's one of these basics that if you mess up, it just makes everything look bad. It doesn't matter if you got everything else right. If your posture's all off, you just look like something's wrong, you know, it's not quite right. So you got to get that down, right? Or you essentially, you've got to keep working on it for a long time. And so we had this, you know, drilled into us. Okay, always remember, the most important thing is posture. Second most important thing is timing. Or those two together are the most important, and then you know, let's work on all the other bits that are also important, but are not as important as those top two. But then, you know, there was a friend on the dance team, because we had a team, who actually in her routine, she had a move, like a thing that they did to kind of stylize it. They introduced it where they actually deliberately would break posture in a kind of stylized way. So instead of standing up straight, they would do something where they would kind of go, oh, I can't really do it, but it's like they would kind of like do something like, you know, whatever, like something like this, right? And so their posture went deliberately off and then back on again. And the point of this, the reason why they were allowed to go off is, one, it was deliberate, but secondly, it's because their posture is always so good. So it's like when you look at it, you can see that like, oh, the posture is really, really good. And then when they break it, it was like a kind of stylistic thing, instead of being like, well, that's just an accident. And it doesn't look good if it's an accident. It looks good if it's on purpose. Now, I don't know if I've strayed a bit away from the topic.
No, because that again implies kind of a knowledge. But you said one sentence that I find truly important in this is knowledge in physical element, and you said it as what you know what good and bad feels like.
Yeah.
So you've practiced enough so that you have an embodied sense of this is a good swing, or I am standing right now. And you don't have to check, are my knees bent? How are my feet? But you just know. And there's this sense of this is it.
Yeah, and this is again common across mental and bodily stuff, that as you become more expert, you gain an intuition which is more and more reliable. So an expert's intuition is highly reliable and very useful. It's not completely foolproof, but it's highly reliable. Whereas a beginner's intuition is essentially not useful at all, or very little use. And so the beginner is, because intuition is almost another word for long-term memory. Well, it's not quite, but it's a bit like, you know, this is stuff. It's not exactly the same. Sometimes I'm a little bit blurry with my concepts I'm naming here, but you know, there's kind of processing that's happening that's not really going on inside your working memory. And it's because of your large amount of background. So another thing is with dancing is like, you've also watched, so you've watched a lot before. You know a lot of principles like explicitly, but you also know what things feel like. You know, all those things, and that can. One thing, for example, is like if you one way to learn dancing is to have a very explicit routine, to say like, okay, we do this and then this and then this, and you sort of rigidly always follow it. And then you're not trying to gain flexibility in your routine. You're trying to gain flexibility or not gain flexibility. You're trying to become better at making it look good, or making it look appropriate for the style, right? So that's where all your effort goes, and you're thinking about like how you're moving rather than
Which, by the
what your
way,
moves are.
I think one of the ways to look at good, when you just say good, is coherence. Like that, what you do is coherent, because it's a certain style has a coherence, and something may be off in that style that would fit perfectly in a different style.
Yeah. So it looks more sort of purposive or something, like you're doing it on purpose, but also not like you're working hard. It looks like effortless, but also purposeful at the same time. That's the best. That's top style. So yeah. I kind of lost where I was now. I was talking about, sorry,
processing going on outside of working memory, and that you can either go for.
I remember what it was now. So it was that sometimes so yeah, you're practicing trying to improve the quality of your moves, let's say, rather than change your moves. But then there might be, if you go to a competition or some sort of dance event or something, where there is where lots of people are dancing on the floor at once and you've never seen them before, or even at practice. Actually, this happens at practice, but particularly at this kind of event, and you might be on a collision course with someone, or actually have collided with someone. You try not to do that, but people are moving around, so like you could collide, or you could almost collide. So the way that that's handled by beginners and experts is different. I think that's partly got to do with the idea of the flexibility that's built up through the large amounts of knowledge, right? So one thing is the expert is more likely to be able to come up with something that they've never, and like moves of their feet, or kind of like do something on the floor that they've never done before, but fits the space, because they're kind of generalizing from their large amount of knowledge about they've got an innate sense of how they should stand and how their feet should move and how they should treat their partner, or they just treat each other on the floor, and what their connection is like. They've got an innate sense of all of that, and so they can do something in the style of that, even though it's nothing they've ever done before or even seen before. And this might be, so they might have to stop, which might even be sudden, but then they'll return to what they're doing gracefully. Whereas a beginner would start and they go, oh my God, okay, and then they go, okay, wait. 1, 2, 3, and they'd kind of have to be like very explicit with each other about it, and start from some particular point instead of sort of fluidly moving back into things. Because that's another thing. Like if you've got a routine, you're going around the floor or whatever, then a beginner would have to start at some particular point, whereas and have to probably say something to their partner to say, let's start from here. Whereas if you're experts, then because of the connection you also have between each other, what your partner kind of feels like to dance with, and if they do something, you kind of go, oh, I know where they're going with this, and then you can kind of, because you've like molded into each other, and there's also a standard that you're molding to as well. It's partly personal, but it's partly like, well, it's a standard thing that this kind of very subtle body action indicates that we're about to do this, and you very easily move into that. So there's this smoothness and flexibility, and that's built up because you have a generalization of, you've built up a kind of internal generalization of what the style of this dance is, because of your large amount of experience with the dance, partly through carrying it out and partly through watching it, and because of your internalization of the principles, which is partly from hearing them, but much more like when you hear them, you use your working memory to like make your body change that way, and you start to get a feel of like, oh, this is what the kind of embodiment of those principles is. So you're not sort of saying, oh, the posture should be like this. It's not verbal, but like it is verbal when you're trying to like make that minor change, make that small change. And you're just focusing on one thing at a time. Okay, I got to make my posture more like this. Even though, like, again, you got to feel it as well. You got to be like, okay, my posture should feel like whatever. Yeah. Sorry, that was kind of rambling.
No, it isn't, because I think this brings together a lot of the things that I'm thinking about because I'm trying to really grasp teaching. For a very varied modality in which I'm teaching. I'm teaching in a modality where we're trying to teach principles, and then we're basically trying to teach people how to use those principles through the body but also through language, through speaking and movement. And it's so much data to try to teach that coherently. So I really get these points you're making. I have a few thoughts that I find just interesting right now. Like, number one, when you said it's this journey from beginner to expert, the first question that comes into my mind is expert at what? And this is for instance where, even if we just talk about dance, it's ballroom dancing is an expert at maybe a few moves and a routine. Whereas, for instance, the way I learned tango, there was no routine. The way I learned tango, there isn't even a basic step to do. But tango then was all about walking and communication. So then you become an expert at communication with the other person through slight bodily shifts, rather than having a certain routine. And which is then a different skill set that's built. So it's always a question of expert at what, and what are the chunks you're teaching. And at the same time, you need to figure out what is the bare minimum baseline that we need to teach, so that based on that baseline, we can then teach more details, we can teach more principles. So that in a ballroom dancing way could be, these are two moves you can string together, and then we go into how's your posture while you do those two moves. Whereas, for instance, with the tango argentino, I learned it was like, okay, walk through the room. And the 4 moves you can do are like walking forwards, taking a step to the side, and making a pause, and walking backwards. And then it's like, you start with that. And rather than everyone having a routine, you just walk, and then you're being taught principles on top of that. So again, what's the foundation and how do you build on that?
Yeah, I can connect with you on the Argentine tango thing, because I've actually learned some. I would class myself still as a beginner, and I would actually say it's probably my favorite dance now of anything I've ever tried. I like it a lot. Much preferred to ballroom tango, which is also fun, but it's completely different. But yeah, so like I mean, I can fill in some of these details of the differences between these styles. So yeah, ballroom dancing isn't really a social thing. I know in Germany, actually, there is a lot of social ballroom dancing, but the way that I was taught it wasn't really taught as a social thing so much. It was much more of a performance thing. And so there was a focus on, essentially what you're trying to do is trying to look like these other people look, and everyone, even people who are completely untrained, recognizes these people as looking very graceful. So there's some sort of way in which you can recognize beauty in their and grace in their motion from an artistic standpoint, even if you have no experience of dance ever. So somehow they're connecting with something more fundamental about aesthetics here. But then, and as a result, you just essentially want to look like them. So you're trying to do what they do.
At the same time, whenever I look at their faces while they're performing, I just want to vomit, because it's this.
Yeah, there's a standard which, there are some sort of standards they follow, which
even though I may like their movement, just looking at their faces, I always feel really weird.
Yeah.
No, you're not feeling like that. Oh.
I get what you mean. Yeah. So with tango, the number one question is how well you can communicate with your partner. So you need a lot of experience of communicating with a partner, which means it's better to have multiple partners to dance with. You go to a class and you dance with, like, as a guy, you dance with like 10 or 20 or whatever different girls, which is important because they will feel different. They're different shapes and sizes, whatever, and they're going to respond. If they're beginners or more advanced, also they'll hear what you say with your body differently and respond differently. More, you can kind of feel the difference of that, and you need to get used to all this kind of playing field of all the different. You're kind of building an internal map of all these different. Well, not exactly. It's not like a map you're going to go to and refer to, but it's more like a kind of sense of what the landscape is. And so when a new person turns up in this landscape, you're like, well, they're kind of, you don't really think about this, but you're kind of like, well, I know they live in this kind of space, so they're probably going to behave like this.
And that's another thing, because in a way it is knowledge. Like, and I like calling it a map, but it's not a conceptual map. It's a felt sense. It's a sense. It's, oh, this can work, and oh, this now fits. But that didn't exist as knowledge before you started to learn tango. It's like that's the knowledge that has been built. So yeah, it is knowledge, but it's a different type of knowledge, and it is taught differently than chemistry.
Yeah, so okay. I probably keep talking about dance for like another hour, but we got to move on to this other thing you want to talk about, right? Which is about connecting between this and I think it feels like a success so far. What I've said so far, it feels like I've sounded very wise about dance. So as I move on to another place, I can try my best at
chemistry.
So I mean, when it comes to let me take on chemistry for a moment and see how much we can see connections there. So with chemistry, I would rate myself as a good chemistry teacher personally, because I have a very organized way of teaching it, and I think on the majority of the time, chemistry is taught in a relatively disorganized way, in my opinion, compared to the way I teach anyway. So I teach chemistry along the lines of principles, and I think that does a much better job than much of chemistry teaching doesn't really do that. So in that respect, for me, talking about, I'm trying to get people to understand forces inside the atom and the structure of the atom and energy. Okay, these are three ideas, or two or three. You can call forces and structure, anyway, whatever. Actually, they're three. The three ideas. I just.
You've decided.
I've decided it's three. Right. There are three ideas which are really, really central to chemistry. Sometimes I call it all of chemistry, as an idea that, if you not just understand this and you can sort of repeat these principles back to me, but also that many examples and you see how it's applied everywhere, then in a way it's like it touches all of chemistry. So that's why, or it covers most of chemistry. So that's why I call it all of chemistry. It's a slightly tongue-in-cheek way of talking about it, but it's also because I can usually explain it within less than an hour, like maybe 30 minutes or something. And it really is this fundamental base where you always keep returning to it. It's like the arithmetic of chemistry or something, or the alphabet of chemistry. You can't live without the alphabet if you're trying to write something down. So or read something. So yeah, so with chemistry, I have these principles, and I say, okay, here are some principles, and then everything from there, I try to build up using the principles. And usually what I'm doing is I'm actually taking someone who already has a lot of chemistry knowledge, usually in a relatively disorganized and confused format, because typically these are kids who go to school most of the time, and they've heard a lot of stuff in their chemistry lessons, and they don't really get it. And it's, I'm not really very good at chemistry. So what I'm doing is I'm getting, okay, you've got this massive like stuff that is not in good order. Here are the ways it needs to be ordered. Now let's get all of the stuff that you actually have in your head, but you're kind of like confused as to what it's doing. And let's put it in order by like aligning it with all these principles. It's like a rapid learning almost scenario, because instead of them having to go through these examples for the first time ever, they've actually seen all these examples like 10 times before. They've just never seen it in a way that like aligns it with some idea. And so everything gets compressed into a small number of ideas. It's like, there's this kind of double, I'm going to try something here. There's this kind of double directionality between kind of compression and expansion, I almost want to say. So when you have principles, what that's doing is it's getting large amounts of information, compressing them into a tiny space. If you say something like, atoms always look like this, and in chemistry, we're always looking at atoms, then like, think about like, there are a lot of different types of atoms. Atoms are used in a lot of different contexts. Like that's a lot of different stuff you've just said. Or if you say in dance, like, okay, you need to have this kind of posture, that means you need to have that posture at every moment. So like you've compressed like literally a lifetime of dance into one sentence in a way. Like you said, your posture should always be like this, for this dance or whatever, right? So so that's a massive amount of compression, right? But then on the other hand, people can't really understand things in the abstract without the concrete. So the abstract is there, it kind of organizes the concrete. But at the same time, if you just tell someone like, if you just say, oh, you just got to stand like this, they're not going to actually stand like that. They've got to go through a process of training. Like, or if you just tell someone, well, this is what atoms are like, they're not going to suddenly be a world-class chemist or pass all their exams. They've got to see all the examples, and they've got to see how it fits in, right? So what you're doing is then what you've kind of done for them is you've said, okay, here's a principle, this is a kernel, this is like a compression of everything. But you, because of the nature of humanity or the nature of minds or something, you won't actually properly understand what I'm saying until I give you like 25 or 100 examples, and you understand how it applies to all those examples. And then what will happen is those 100 things in your mind, in a sense, will be one thing, because they'll all be examples of this idea. But also you will have 100 things in your mind. So it does require time, and it's expansive. That's what I'm talking about. There's like this expansion of the principle, but the principle is fundamentally compressive in the sense that it gets like lots and lots of examples and like sort of like zips them into one like this. So I think, you know, that I think is true in chemistry, and that I think is true in dance. And those are definitely very different fields, and one is mental and one is physical.
And I would say that this contraction, expansion, or concentration, decentration, which is one of my favorite philosophers, Walter Russell, crazy dude. He talked of these two forces in the universe. There are but two forces. It's concentration, decentration, concentration, decentration, which to me, even if I look at all my knowledge of the body and everything, like that's kind of the movement of life in many ways. Is if something doesn't concentrate and decentrate, it's not really alive, like our heart, our lungs, cells, everything. So
sounds like tension and release as well. You get this in art.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's kind of this, and we need both movements also for learning and teaching. So we want to get people to, and this is the core of it, but let's look at the core. And if we only look at the examples, which is very easy to do with chemistry, because you try to keep chemistry class fun, so you always do all of these experiments, but you don't really get to the core. Mm-hmm. Like you miss this part. But if you only stay here, people are like, how does this relate to anything? Like, maybe. So you need to then take this and be like, okay, and now we do 50 experiments with it, but we return here. Mm-hmm. So it's this.
I think that's part of the power of, and this is somehow I'm doing really well at this ad-libbing stuff. It's going better than I thought. But as part of the power of the idea of using principles is the whole thing about everything is connected. You'll hear lots of people say everything is connected, which itself is, you know, by nature of being a vague term, it's not even exactly clear which field we're in when I say that. But I mean, in this particular case, I mean to say about knowledge that whatever field, you know, whatever event you're witnessing can be understood from many different angles, and therefore, and that's one way in which there is a connection between many different ways of viewing it. You know, you could view a scene of people doing a thing, whatever it is, I don't know, people going shopping or something, and then you could say, well, there's an economic angle to it, but there's also a physics angle to it, and there's also a, you know, and there's also a psychological angle, and there's a mathematical angle, and there's like a spiritual angle, and there's just like so many angles. And then because they're all living inside like this shopping trip, then like there's an intersection of all these things. But then essentially, you know, that here's where I'm at risk of losing myself and just saying some stuff and wondering if I'm making any sense. But like, it's almost like the principles of these different fields are kind of intersect, or like, you know, you get the same thing and you think of it with different principles, but it's still the same thing. It's like a model. It's like a model of that thing, but then you can do it with this other principle, and then you say, oh, look, it's connected because you can use these principles on the same thing. I don't know. I'm just going to go with that. I don't know if it's.
I mean, to me, it would make sense with two things. Like, number one, you can always look at anything from multiple views, and if your principles, like if the kind of understanding on whatever realm you have is in any way precise, mm-hmm. it will be more or less stable over time. That doesn't mean it is always exactly the same, but the principles will still apply to a situation. If you've truly understood like evolutionary principles, you can look at many situations and see the same evolutionary forces at work. The same with economic forces. They are always kind of the same. So I would even imagine that you can look at 10 different situations, and if you have one person who's very good at seeing the evolutionary force in it, and you have another person who's very good at seeing the exchange on a monetary or energy level or whatever you want to do to look at economics in this, like they will even be close with their interpretations on every single one of those 10 situations because their principles are precise. So it will give a picture that is probably close on each of the 10 situations, because principles are principles.
It depends a bit on how sort of commensurable the two principles are. So like economics and evolution are taken as a particular example. I think they're relatively okay in terms of agreement. I think you could try to find two fields or disciplines where they're just so not talking about the same thing. So like
and then the question would be, what the fuck are they talking about?
What do you mean?
I mean, if they're not talking about the same thing, then the question would be, what are they talking about?
I suppose you could say they are talking about the same thing, but they're focused in a different place, and as a result, it just ends up feeling very different as a result. Or the kinds of things they're interested in.
Do you have an example?
They get this whole picture, and they're interested in this bit, and these people are interested in this bit, and then this doesn't sound like they're talking about the same thing anymore. Like if you've got something like physics versus economics, generally these are not people talking about the same thing, even though they might be looking in the same situation.
Yeah. Okay. If you go like physical forces in the situation and economic, yeah, that makes sense. I don't have forever anymore today, unfortunately. I'm sorry about that. But I'm taking a few things just as thoughts from this. It's this. The first one is, especially with physical skills, but it's the same again for intellectual skills. You need to build some sort of routine that you can then build upon. You need to build a baseline to build upon that. And
it's more that you're trying to change something, and there are some cases where, so for example, if you're trying to change something that you are creating in one way or another, you have to create something in order to change the way that you're creating it. So you have to make it differently. So a dance is something that you create. This is just like a thing that happens because of your movement. So you need to have some kind of movement there in the first place in order to change the way you do the movement. That's why you need a routine. If you're talking about like solving equations, it's not really a routine. It's just that if you're trying to learn how to solve an equation, then you're going to, the way to do that is to see equations, to be presented with equations and try to solve them. That I wouldn't exactly call that routine, but it's like,
even there, you would have to start with a really simple equation and solve that and build that foundation. And then you can get more abstract. You wouldn't start with like a 100 variable equation. You would start with x equals whatever.
So I think, the whole thing about, perhaps it's a different way I'm thinking about the idea of routine. Like it's, the way I think of routine, it's more like it's your way of creating something so that you can change the thing that you're creating. I mean, if I think about fields which are more about problem solving rather than about creation, maths being an example of such a field, then you don't really need anything that's similar to a dance routine. But if it's like, suppose that you're a painter, you're going to have to paint something, and then suppose it might just be like you're just going to do some paintings, and that's okay. But if you're kind of you're trying to become like a better painter in whatever style or whatever it is, then it would be like, okay, I'm going to focus on my, to be honest, I don't know what they focus, color or something, right? So then it'll be like, I'm trying to apply these color principles. So I'm just going to paint something, but like my real focus is like, can I make the color the way that I want it to be in these paintings? And so there's the like the routine of the dance is like a painting. You need to do something, right? But then the focus of improvement is like some aspect of it.
And I would have just, for me, the word routine was because we used that earlier with the dance routine. But I would probably go, and maybe routine is the wrong word, but you need to put down some sort of foundation of what you're talking about. And so I would say the same has to happen with maths, because you have to explain to somebody who has absolutely no idea of maths Like, so you're solving an equation. This is what an equation is. This is kind of what you do when you solve an equation.
Oh.
You need to put that groundwork down, and then you can build on that.
Yeah. So you kind of need to define the space in which you're working.
Yeah.
And that does require some initial explanations or initial knowledge gain of like, okay, so what are we even doing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So and it includes a knowledge gain of what are we doing, but also then a knowledge of actually doing it and gaining that experience and that knowledge, and that with physical tasks has a much bigger part to it than in a purely intellectual endeavor. The actual doing and getting the feedback from the body and knowing how it feels and all of that is probably a lot more important than with solving equations. Like, you need to dance a routine more often than you need to solve the same equation.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, in both cases, this basic idea that you're going to have kind of the two kinds of memory. There's storage memory and storage strength and retrieval strength of memory. So so like, whenever you hear someone say something, then it stores inside you in some sense. But then when you say it yourself, that's retrieval. And retrieval is, if you have really strong storage strength, you may not have very weak retrieval strength anyway. That's one of the reasons you can trick yourself when you're reading your own notes. You think you know them, but that's because they're very familiar, which means you have high storage strength already. So when you read them, you're like, oh yeah, I know this. But then when you actually try and say them, it might be quite hard to say them because your retrieval strength is too low. And it might be that there's because there is some connection. If you have a high storage strength, if you hear the same thing lots of times, you're more likely to be able to repeat it, even if you've never said it before. So like, there is a relation between these two. It's not like completely separate, or it's not like they don't influence one another. But I wonder whether in terms of physical things, if you, for example, watch someone doing a physical thing, probably perhaps has less of an effect than watching someone, I don't know, solve an equation or whatever it is, like analyze a chemical or whatever it is, right? It's, I imagine that that kind of watching has an effect, but it's perhaps in physical skills, it's more important. Like the retrieval and storage gap might be wider or whatever it is. And so you need doing it actually as a, or perhaps you could say is different enough, because when you watch it, you use your eyes, and when you do it, you use your body. And there's like kind of, there's enough space there between those that I imagine there's more need to do action and practice in, even though there's need in both, there's more need in physical stuff to do action and practice.
Then I have a few more, and because I would love to have, again, I enjoy these conversations. They are great fun to me. So I would love to have a few more on these. The second one I find as a really interesting question is expertise or expert at what? And that this, I think that you can basically use the same thing, like dance, to become an expert at really different things, depending on how you view the dance and how you teach it.
Yeah.
So I find that a pretty interesting thing. But this again brings us, you need to build knowledge of some sort, but through the knowledge you can teach different principles. Like, that's a very interesting question of what is this expertise you're teaching?
It's a subtle point, because most of the time when people are in the same field, they have the same goals and believe in the same kind of styles or values. Whereas in dance is a good example of something where we don't have to have the same, almost like we don't have the same goals. Like someone who's doing ballroom dancing might not really in their mind be like thinking about, I'm going to go out there and have a night out when I dance with like 20 people. They might not be thinking about that at all. So it's like that is just off the table forever of their dancing career almost. Whereas the Argentinian tango thing might be like, well, if like the number one thing I need to do is know how to lead as a gentleman, right? Like I need to communicate. That's the number one thing. So it's like they're because their goals are disparate, even though the field is apparently the same, it ends up, yeah. And that's only sometimes the case. So it's quite a subtle point, but it's definitely true.
And the third question I have, and I think this is a very good question, is this: what makes teaching good. So what you were saying about your chemistry teaching, it's organized, it's understanding principles, this compression and expansion. And I think that's a very interesting concept, also to have this idea of what do I need to compress and bring down to principle, but also where do I need to give examples and exercises, and what's the rhythm of that?
I suppose one way of thinking about it is you can imagine it as a network, where there are central hubs or central spots in the network, and you need to start from there, and that's like the principles. But then all of the different applications of these principles are like different sub-regions that connect to that network, or sub-networks that connect to that network. And so you're kind of like you're building up this network where if you only have the center, you actually can't see most of the network. If you've got most of the network but you're missing the center, then it's a disorganized mess. So you need to have the center and the rest, and the like breadth. So the breadth means that you can apply this center everywhere, and the center means everything's organized and makes sense together. I think that's one way of putting it.
Yeah. So those are just, I think, very interesting things to follow up on. And for today, I have to run because I have my next call in 5 minutes. So okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to finish the recording here. You never know what's around